Say my name when no one is around you.
Hey, Mr. Smith, what you up to?
Uh, hey, Miss Turner, I was just thinking about what it means to really study history.
Wow, it really didn't look like you were deep in thought when I joined. It looked like you were checking out your own hair.
Listen, Mrs. T, I can do two things at the same time.
Sure, I knew it. I caught you. Okay, but what do you mean you were thinking about what it means to study history?
Well, so many people think of history as if it's just memorizing a bunch of facts and dates, or I don't know, a bunch of spice charts every day. And the truth is, understanding the facts of history is fun and important and oftentimes kind of interesting. But I think that history is so important when you have the ability to make connections and recognize patterns, because that's what makes us stronger, more critical thinkers. And that's what makes history something that's meaningful outside of the classroom. I think
Hmm.
it's so important that we continue making connections.
Oh, connections, like cause and effect relationships?
Yes, or finding similarities and differences and being able to explain them. So, do you want to make some connections of our own?
Heck yeah, I do.
Awesome. Let's try to find some similarities and differences between the Spanish and British empires.
Let's get to it, Governor.
Look, I love you, but you're no Hermione. So maybe no accent. Okay, so before we can make some connections, we should probably review the information we know about the two empires.
I know the British colonies.
Oh, Lord. Listen, this is starting to get embarrassing.
Fine. The British colonies were mostly in the Americas, but also developed some in the Indian Ocean.
Great start, because the same is true for Spanish colonies.
Yep, good point. But I'm sure we know more than just geography.
For sure. Say 5 things you remember from our notes over the last couple days.
Okay, 1. The Spanish Empire used slaves to do their labor.
Okay, I know I said 5 things, but I have to point out that they had different groups of slaves. At first, they tried to use indigenous people that they enslaved, and they even used an indigenous slave system called mita. But enslaving indigenous people was hard because the Spanish people gave them so many diseases that nearly 90% of the indigenous population died. And there just weren't enough people for the Spanish to effectively enslave. Plus, who do you think knew the land better? Indigenous people or Spaniards?
The indigenous people.
Right. So it was so much easier for them to escape. So the Spanish people actually turned to the Portuguese Atlantic slave trade, and they began to import kidnapped Africans into the Americas and force those Africans as slaves to do their labor for them, especially in sugar colonies.
Okay, will you let me finish now?
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, 2. The British used joint stock companies to charter their colonies rather than the king ruling over them directly. 3. Jamestown was the first British colony. 4. There was a new social structure in Spanish America called the casta system. And 5. Both empires used mercantilism to force their colonies to grow cash crops.
I cannot stand you, right? All right. Can I say 5 things now?
Of course, but you have to use at least one accent.
Listen, I'm not doing that. I'm just not doing that. In both empires, settlers were motivated by Christianity.
But
Hey, it's still my turn.
fine, do it in an accent.
But the Spanish were Catholic, and most of the settlers from the British Empire practiced Protestant Christianity. Number 3, you mentioned the Spanish role in the Atlantic slave trade, but slavery in the British Empire was also pretty prolific. And number 2, white people, indigenous people, and African people were completely kept apart. The only racial mixing that existed in the British Empire was essentially because of rape. I mean, think about it. If the white man literally owns the African or indigenous person, is sex consensual? Of course not. And my last fact, the British Empire started until after the Spanish, but it ultimately was the longer lasting, wealthier, and more powerful of the two.
Well, we seem to know a whole lot about these two empires.
Yeah, but remember what I was saying about history? It's not supposed to be a boring list of facts. I want us to make meaningful connections to help us better understand and practice critical thinking.
All right, so show me your brainstorm.
All right, so while we were talking, this is what I wrote down.
Dude, that is not very helpful yet. Let me organize it for you.
So I'm gonna need you to talk me through that.
Okay, so here's what I did. I took all of our facts that we had written down, I took your notes, and I sorted them. So I sorted into the facts about the British Empire and facts about the Spanish Empire. But I didn't leave it at that. I also made connections between facts that were on the same topics. So the dotted line is taking one fact about the British Empire and connecting it to something related to the Spanish Empire under that same topic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like you're saying, okay, these are categories, and this is what it was like in this category in the British Empire, and this is what it was like in the same category in the Spanish Empire.
Yes.
So I'm thinking that it might be helpful if we label these connections.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Well, the top one is geography.
All righty here. Well, how about that?
Impressed. How about I take a try? Voila. Take that, sucker.
Oh, wow. So it seems like you're trying to make a competition out of this, aren't you? Well, I'll tell you what. You go ahead and do the next one. I think it's easy enough even for you.
Hey, that was too easy. I'm going to do the next one too.
Oh my gosh. Okay, Turner, I see what you did this time. But I think you might have actually outsmarted yourself. Can you explain what you just did?
Well, you wanted to get serious about making historical connections, but the thing about history is that it isn't always simple. When it comes to forced labor in these empires, there were similarities and differences. I mean, they both resorted to the amoral slave trade, but the Spanish tried a few other amoral systems first. By the time the Brits started their global empire, they really never attempted to enslave indigenous people. They jumped straight into the slave trade.
Well, Turner, it looks like all that ridiculous stretching actually might have worked. So let me take a stab at this complicated explanation.
Dang, dude, you didn't even stretch and you still mastered this. Go ahead and explain that one to me.
Well, see, in both empires, the European concept of race played a significant role in the development of new social structures. In both cases, these concepts left legacies that affect the world we live in today. I mean, look at the Spanish Empire. When the Spanish Empire was settling Latin America, which is what we call it now, it was a brand new thing. Nobody had ever really explored overseas and settled new territory. And mostly Spanish men, single young men, left Spain and came to the Americas. As a result, as they stayed in the Americas to do the work that they set out to do, they still wanted to have families. But because not many Spaniard women were coming for the first couple generations of people, they found themselves making families with indigenous women and African women who had been kidnapped and imported to the Americas. This meant that they had mixed race families, and their mixed race children were a part of those families. That's how castas was developed. Castas was an intricate social structure where the status in the hierarchy was based on race and racial mixing, with the purest white people who immigrated from Spain at the very top, and indigenous and African people at the very bottom, with dozens of layers of racial mixing in between. But in North America, where the British Empire was, most of the people who left Britain and came to the Americas came as families, seeking an opportunity to practice their version of Christianity the way they wanted to, without another version of Christianity interfering. Because they brought their own families, they had very little interest in creating mixed race families. And they kept enslaved Africans completely separate. Now, that does not mean that there was no racial mixing. There's such a thing as mixed race people in North America as well. But oftentimes, a free white man was having sex with a Black woman who didn't have the freedom to offer her own consent. And that man refused to recognize a Black child as his own. And so there was no concept of racial mixing. The idea was any part Black made a Black person, and therefore, in the British Empire, a slave. So there was very much clearer and delineated racial differences in North America. And the thing is, we can see the legacy of this racial system continue into the structures that we live in this world today.
Wow, that was a really deep connection, Mr. Smith. You know, I'm really proud of the work we're doing, but I think we can take this one step further.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about practicing our thinking skills, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so let's use our skills to articulate these historical connections in academic sentences.
Brilliant idea. But no more stretching.
Man, you have a lot of rules. No accents, no stretching. You gotta let me have one.
Oh my gosh, fine. Stretch.
Okay.
Oh, your poor keyboard. Hey, we can tell this is an act. You've been exposed.
Ooh. So during the early modern period, 1450 to 1750, both the Spanish and the British empires expanded into the Americas and land around the Indian Ocean.
Great job. It follows all the rules we've learned about for making a clear comparative argument.
Yep. Wait, what rules?
Well, it characterized both regions, it uses comparative terminology, and it compares factors that are in the same category. But can you do it with a difference? Oh, never mind. I'll go ahead and do it. Colonists were motivated to settle new territory by their desire to spread religion. But most Spanish settlers were Catholics, and most British settlers practiced Protestantism.
Wow, that was fast, but let's do the checklist and see if it follows all the rules. Rule 1, both regions? Yep, I see characteristics of both the British and the Spanish. Rule 2, comparative terminology. But Rule 3, category. Wow, you found some complicated connections.
What can I say?
Do you want to tell them or should I?
Well, I guess I'll be the bad guy. Okay, y'all. To earn credit for this activity, you have to turn in your notes guide. But make sure you write an academic sentence for each of the last 3 connections we made. If you don't, you won't be able to earn more than a 70 on this activity. Cheerio!